Yeah, it's super great and definitely worth thinking about. So the next question here then is, can you talk about the story in your book where you talk about Van Zant and how that kind of, in your view at least, part you can like answer the question of like biblical ambiguity?
Yeah, so there are different Van Zants. Any fans of Leonard Skinner know about Johnny and Ronnie Van Zant, but here we're talking about Gus Van Zant. Gus Van Zant is a film director, critically acclaimed one, I would say. And in 2003, he had a film come out called Elephant. And the film depicts a day in the life of a high school. And as events unfold in the high school, they culminate in a school shooting that looks a lot like the Columbine shooting that happened in Littleton, Colorado 4 years earlier in 1999. Now, the one thing that is that Elephant was a very polarizing film. Some critics loved the film. Other critics really critiqued it. And interestingly, they critiqued it on moral grounds. And their argument was that Van Zant failed as a director because he presented the events of the film without commentary, without any framing devices to how we should interpret the events of an unfolding school shooting. In other words, they believed there should have been a clearer moral indictment of the events in the film on behalf of the filmmaker. And that by failing to provide that, the filmmaker failed in his moral obligation to the viewing audience. But very interestingly, my favorite, all-time favorite film reviewer, Roger Ebert, he offered a response to that. And he says, on the contrary, the fact that Van Zant refuses to provide commentary, a framing interpretive structure for the events that unfold in that film is exactly where its moral responsibility lies. That he's not going to spoon feed us quick and simple answers to explain and interpret a school shooting. Rather, he's going to leave it in our laps. His role is to depict it in cinematic form. And we now have to wrestle with the moral fallout and understand how we interpret it and how we are going to seek to prevent that happening in the future. And the point there is that the critic of the Bible, I think, does something similar. They say God failed in his obligations to communicate to us by allowing for there to be events depicted within Scripture which are open to the belief, the interpretation that God actually did command these things. And God failed if God does not explicitly indict and condemn those actions described in Scripture. And on the contrary, I would argue that just as Van Zant was being a responsible filmmaker by withholding that additional layer of analysis, so I think God is being a responsible agent communicating to us his will by withholding at points the interpretive framework for how to digest or process that. So I believe the ambiguity that exists within the text is there for the moral formation of the Christian community as they read the text Christologically through Christ, informed by our moral knowledge, and we wrestle through the meaning and interpretation and application of the text.
Yeah, it's super good. So just kind of like thinking about this idea of moral formation, and a lot of times it's like, yes, that is a great thing. Like at least part of the reason I think God is hidden is like he wants us to work together and figure these things out and like try to understand the world. But then I think a lot of times like we don't actually like your vision of using this to form our character and become more like Christ. Like we don't do this when we approach like especially like the warfare tactics or things like this. It's more of just like trying to debate and like make our side be right rather than actually like trying to like grow and understand these things. So like what do you think about like that kind of idea, Randall, kind of challenging this idea of there being this spiritual formation with this biblical ambiguity?
So I think I can sort of frame the response or the counter argument that you're presenting here as follows: that the idea is maybe in principle that works, but sometimes a text, whether it be a cinematic text or a literary text, we can just think about text very broadly here.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes a text is so open to misunderstanding and miscommunication that simply undermines the positive moral formative outcome of the degree of ambiguity that exists within the text.
Yeah.
I actually give an illustration of this in the chapter from the music group. They're called a horrorcore rap group called Insane Clown Posse.
Mm-hmm.
I admit I'm not a fan of Insane Clown Posse, but I do find their story to be kind of interesting. So they appeared again in the early 1990s, and they were releasing independent albums, and they amassed a cult following of rabid fans called Gigolos. And the thing is that the lyrical content of Insane Clown Posse is very graphic. It's sexually violent and physically violent. I quote a critic in the book saying that their music is like sub Eminem, not the candy M&Ms, but Eminem the rapper, in terms of its misogyny and its violence. And yet around 10 years ago, Insane Clown Posse, they're a duo, by the way, they came out and they said, well, in fact, all of this is sort of an act. We're really like followers of God. There's some ambiguity as to whether they really would count themselves as Christian or not. But they do say that we really want to follow God, and all of the violence and misogyny and sexual violence and so on, that's really there just to sort of challenge us to move beyond that and to adopt a life of selflessness and following God. The problem is that their fans didn't seem to get that point, because their fans are notoriously violent and destructive. And in fact, the FBI has categorized the Gigolos as a gang. In a way that once you get on the FBI's radar, then that's pretty serious, right? So you would say, okay, if Insane Clown Posse is being genuine and they really were ironically presenting all of this violent and sexual content, then they really failed in their communication to challenge and form their listening audience, because the audience completely missed the point. And there does seem to come a point where you could say, well, Christians throughout history seem to have missed the point because they have so often defended particular violent readings of Scripture, which is inconsistent with the formative purposes of Scripture to become more like Jesus. I admit that that's a problem, right? It does. I can understand how people can see it like that. What I would want to do here is say that what we have here is a parallel to the general problem of evil, right? It's like, well, how could God have morally sufficient reasons to allow this degree of evil in the world? How could God have morally sufficient reasons to allow this degree of ambiguity within the text? And one response that Christians make to the general problem of evil has been called skeptical theism, which I think is an unhelpful term, but I'll use it for the sake of clarity. The idea there is that even if you cannot understand all the reasons that God has, morally sufficient reasons to allow this degree of evil in the world, we should not think that that is an objection to God existing and allowing evil, because we may not be privy to all the reasons God has to allow evil. So the fact that we cannot understand what they could be is not an objection to think he does not have them. And I think that there's a parallel argument here. The fact that we can't understand and perceive all the reasons that God can have to allow the degree of moral ambiguity that exists in the interpretive community with respect to Scripture is not a reason to think God does not have reasons to allow that degree of moral ambiguity. He could very well have those reasons, even though we are not privy to all of those reasons. So I think that that's a legitimate way of rebutting the objection. Now, it doesn't necessarily satisfy the critic. The critic might still say, well, I'm not convinced. Well, that's fine. You're not going to convince everybody of everything ever. But I do think that it is a good response for a Christian who is concerned about that ambiguity, that they need not be too concerned, because they can trust God even though they don't know all the reasons he has for allowing that ambiguity.